All right, thank you again, everyone, for joining our conference, the Midwest Migration Network, Connecting Birds and People in the Midwest. We're about to begin, but before we get started today, I want to begin with a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded, and all participants will be muted for the duration of the program. So I want to direct you to the participants and chat function on the Zoom platform, and you can use the chat box to submit questions or comments to our moderating team and our hosts. And unless otherwise requested, we're suggesting, since we have a large group, a large audience today, that only really use the chat for questions to our speakers. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can also send me a private chat. My name is Stephanie Bilke. You can also email me if you're having any issues, and my email address is stephanie.bilke@audubon.org, and I'll just spell that in case anyone is joining by phone. So that's stephanie.bilke@AUD as in dog, UB as in boy, ON.org. So I'll enter that in the chat as well. So to get us started for today's program, I'm going to first introduce everyone to Tom Will, who will be our moderator for the session today. Tom has worked for the Migratory Bird Program for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the last 20 years and has lived in Nicaragua and Mexico for a total of 5 years. Though he remembers birding as a kid, it was an eastern kingbird that reawakened his love of birding when he was a high school English teacher in Connecticut. So welcome, Tom. Take it away for us.
Thanks, Stephanie. And thank you, everybody out there in virtual land, for attending the very first ever virtual conference of the Midwest Migration Network. It's my understanding that we have close to 200 people registered for the sessions that will be extending over the next 3 days. So I'd like to give you just a brief overview of how this conference, this virtual conference, is organized and what those 3 days will look like. I just want to remind you also that the full program with all the speaker bios is available on the Midwest Migration Network website. So this morning, we'll mostly be focusing on an overview of the Midwest Migration Network and also on bird migration as it's embedded in our understanding of migratory connectivity and full life cycle conservation. This afternoon, Wednesday and Thursday morning, we'll take a closer look at the initiatives that are currently operating under the MMN, the 4 initiatives about which you'll hear shortly. And then Thursday afternoon, at the final session, we'll pause for an opportunity for reflection on everything that's happened, and we'll return to the theme of full life cycle conservation, this time with an emphasis on the non-breeding season and the aspect of connecting people to birds. So for this morning, just briefly, we'll begin with an overview of the Midwest Migration Network from its coordinator, Amber Roth, how it evolved, what its engine looks like, and what really fuels it to keep it going. Then we'll go with a keynote from Pete Marra, which will highlight the epic bird spectacle that brings us all together in the first place, a wonderful spectacle of bird migration, and some of the major themes that are a part of this conference. Then we'll have introductions to the 4 initiative coordinators and an aperitif of what's ahead over the next 4 virtual sessions. And finally, we'll end with an opportunity for participants to talk to one another in breakout rooms and chat with one another. And so without further ado, let's get started with that address by Amber Roth, who's currently an assistant professor in forest wildlife management at the University of Maine. As I said before, she's the coordinator for the Midwest Migration Network. Amber came to birds through her father, who was a birding, and I'm told that as soon as she was old enough to pick up binoculars, she was out birding. And rumor has it that it was her mom's binoculars that she confiscated to do that. She seems to recall that the first bird she ever held in her hand was an American woodcock. Chick, that is. And what could be more captivating than a woodcock chick? So, Amber, take it away.
All right. Do you see my screen? Sorry.
We can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that introduction, Tom. And I want to welcome our network members, our conference participants, and our speakers. As Tom mentioned, this is our first virtual conference, and I'm very excited to see how this goes. Our intent is to send everyone an evaluation after the conference, where we greatly appreciate your feedback about how the conference went, what worked well, what could we improve on. My suspicion is that there will be more virtual conferences in our future for a while, and so feedback is really important for continuing to put on quality programs. Well, my intent here is to give you a little bit of background about the Midwest Migration Network, just a brief introduction to our initiatives and some of their accomplishments, and conclude with an opportunity for you to become more involved if you aren't already a member. So to start with, the Midwest Migration Network was formed in 2012, and I was brought on as a coordinator in 2013. And at that time, we formed a steering committee. And my first charge was to develop a strategic action plan for the network. And the steering committee and I put a lot of time into that, and we published that online in 2015. I will note that that strategic plan is available on our website under resources if you would like to look at that more closely. Between 2014 and 2017, we had a series of workshops that helped with the development of the plan, as well as thinking about how we can implement the plan. And one of the outcomes from those workshops was the creation of 3 initiatives to focus our efforts as a group. A couple years later, about 6 months ago, we added a 4th initiative, the Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition. As I mentioned, we have a steering committee. Here's a list of our current members shown here. Our members represent the diversity of expertise. They also represent a broad geography across the Midwest, as well as some representatives from outside the region, including myself. I'm here in Maine today. And a number of our steering committee members also are part of a leadership team that helps direct a lot of the work of what we're doing. So that includes myself, Jennifer Phillips Vanderberg, Tom Will, Stephanie Bilkey. And I will also now introduce one of our new steering committee members, who's Anna Buckart Thomas from Iowa Department of Natural Resources. She's an avian ecologist. We are hoping to bring on additional steering committee members here soon, just waiting to hear back from them. Within the strategic action planning process, we explored our vision and mission for the network. And this is our vision statement: to provide scientifically sound information to guide conservation and management decisions in the Midwest region that enhance passage of land birds during migration within the context of full life cycle conservation. And note that the emphasis is on land birds. We are open to collaborating with other taxa, but our focus remains on land birds currently. Our mission is to coordinate the efforts of monitoring stations, research programs, and stakeholders as part of a sustainable network focused on conservation efforts needed to sustain migration of land birds through the region. I'm not going to go through the strategic plan in detail, but I will say that we have identified 2 primary focal themes for the direction of the network. The first theme is to help inform full life cycle demographic models. And this is important because we are realizing that to be effective and efficient in our conservation activities and in dedicating resources to those activities, that we need to be able to identify factors that are limiting populations. What are those factors that are driving population declines for species of concern? If we can identify those factors and threats, then we can be more efficient with our resources. The second theme is to better understand migratory connectivity. And for the Great Lakes, this means understanding where different populations are going for the winter. Are they all going to the same place, or are different populations going to different areas on the wintering grounds? And as part of that, it's also important to understand how birds are getting from point A to point B. Do they have different migratory routes? Do they have different characteristics about the timing of their migration? Are they using different types of stopover habitats? So it's about understanding that whole life cycle and how birds are moving across landscapes and continents. And also connecting those things back to demographics. So understanding why one population might be declining and why another population is stable is an important part of both focal themes. Within these themes, we have a number of questions that we have prioritized as a group. And I want to go through these because I think it's important to get a sense of the kinds of things we want to learn as a network. These also tend to be questions that are very large in scope, that are difficult for any one researcher to answer alone. And the strength of a network is by having a lot of different people collaborating, working together, pooling data and information in order to answer these larger questions. So let's go through these. The first one is, which habitat, sites, and airspace are the highest priority for conservation action? This is really important. Also getting back to being efficient and effective in helping land birds during migration, we need to be able to identify the actions that are going to have the most impact. Number two, within species, are there distinct populations with different connectivity and thus different possible contributors to declines? I highlighted this in the last slide. Third, how does survival during migration vary by species, by sex and age within species, and also across years? How does stopover habitat quality affect fitness and survival during migration? We know stopover habitat is really important, but it's hard. We don't have good assessments of habitat quality. In a lot of cases, we don't even know where the stopover habitat is located. The next one, how does winter habitat quality affect survival during migration? We know that for many species that migratory periods might be the point where mortality is the highest. So understanding survival during those periods is really important, and carryover effects from the wintering grounds, also from the breeding grounds, and how that affects survival and migration. Next, when do land birds migrate? And does this vary annually and under different climate change scenarios? Some birds are expected to have changes in their migration ecology and some are not. And we need to understand which species are most affected by climate change. Next, how does body condition and fitness affect survival during migration? This relates to some of the questions above. And then finally, what is the recruitment of juveniles into our populations? How do we improve recruitment? So that gives you a flavor of some of the questions we're trying to answer. And the way that we've chosen to go about answering these questions is actually by organizing ourselves around sort of the methodologies and the technologies that help us to address those questions. So we have 4 initiatives, as I mentioned earlier, and I just want to briefly describe each one of them and some of their accomplishments. The order of the initiatives is the same order as they appear in our program over the next 3 days. So they're not really in any sort of other prioritized order. First is the Banding and Ground Surveys Initiative. The objective for that group is to lead a coordinated bird banding and ground survey effort during the migratory periods. This is intended to fill a gap currently, or up until recently, there were standardized banding protocols for the stationary periods, which is the MAPS and MOSI programs, but there was no standardized protocol for migratory periods. And Mark Shieldcastle has done a great job in leading the effort to create a standardized protocol that we can use during migration at banding stations and other locations. The next initiative on our schedule will be the Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition. And this is the newest of our initiatives. And the focus of the last 6 months has been organization, getting that initiative organized. But their objective is to ensure robust consideration of and protections for birds and bats as part of offshore and nearshore wind energy facility development in the Great Lakes. The third initiative is around the telemetry technologies. The main focus has been on the MODIS wildlife tracking system, and the objective of this group is to expand mobile radio telemetry tracking and expanding the network of stations throughout the region. Currently, there are a lot of stations in the eastern US, but not nearly as many in the Midwest, and we really want to expand that network so that there are greater opportunities for understanding a whole host of questions about not just land birds, but for other animals that make long distance movements like dragonflies and bats, for example. The fourth group is the radar and acoustics group. And the objective of this group is to conduct and facilitate research using NextRad radar, mobile radar stations, and acoustic monitoring devices. Next, I want to highlight just a couple of accomplishments for each of these groups. The banding and ground survey team has, being led by Mark Shieldcastle, he has put on 5 workshops and trained 57 banders from all of the states in the region to use this new protocol that's been developed to use during migratory periods. So we're very excited about the launch of that protocol and that banding stations are beginning to adopt that protocol. The idea is that if we can get all of the banding stations to use the same protocol, then we can collectively use all of that data to answer bigger geographic questions in the region. Second is the Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition. As I mentioned, this group is just getting organized and committees have been formed and they've identified leadership for those committees and sort of the objectives of those committees and what their actions are going to be. And I think you will find in the session at this conference that you'll really see the direction that they're now plowing forward towards with that group. The telemetry group, there are a lot of accomplishments within this group. A lot of our partners have been greatly involved in expanding MODIS stations throughout the region, and I just want to highlight a couple of them. I'm not going to be able to highlight them all, but the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory has planned 7 MODIS stations and a fence across southern Wisconsin. 4 of those stations have already been installed. Missouri Department of Conservation, led by Sarah Kendrick, has installed, I believe, 8 stations, and 7 of those stations are a fence across southern Missouri, with more stations planned to have a contiguous fence all across the state, which will be really fabulous to have a nice fence across the southern part of the region. And we have other partners who have installed stations in Michigan, in northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, Indiana, and Ohio. So it's exciting to really see this network of stations expanding and the potential to expand a lot more so in the future. The 4th group is the radar and acoustics group. And Jeff Bueller will give you a more detailed explanation of some of their accomplishments, but one of the big ones has been an effort led by Jessica Tinklenberg, who is a recently graduated PhD student who is looking at stopover habitat in Indiana using NextRad radar and eBird data. And I hope that Jeff will present some of those results as well, or Jessica will perhaps. One other exciting development for our network is the Connectivity Challenge. And you may not know what this is, but it's a prize that is offered by the Salazar Center for North American Conservation at Colorado State University. And the challenge, this Connectivity Challenge, is aimed to generate innovative ideas that catalyze change, ultimately leading to landscapes that connect habitat, build resilience, and improve the health of our natural systems. A proposal was submitted by Audubon Great Lakes in collaboration with the Midwest Migration Network. And I can't remember the exact number of proposals. I think it was 40 some. And we were chosen as one of the 5 finalists for this prize. And if you go to the website, and I have the website here, connectivitychallenge.org, you can go to the section that highlights our project, which is Birds Connect Us, empowering communities through migratory bird technology. And just to give you a gist of our proposal, we are hoping to use a couple of MODIS tracking stations as a tool for educating members of the community, creating an educational program with the goal of helping to gain information to identify potential areas of green space that could be protected and restored for migratory bird habitat, as well as recreational areas for human beings in urban spaces. So it's a kind of a win-win scenario. How can we make urban spaces better for both birds and people? So please go to that website and take a look at our project and our video that gives an overview of that project. We're going to be giving a final pitch with the other 4 finalists on September 16th. So wish us luck. This is one of our next big projects, is to develop our final presentation. Finally, I want to give you the opportunity to become more involved with the network if you are not already a member. If you go to our website at midwestmigrationnetwork.org, I believe Stephanie is going to put that website address in the chat box. And if you go to our website, this is our homepage. If you click on the membership tab, that will open up a form where you can fill in your information and select any of the 4 initiatives that you may be interested in becoming more involved with and submit the form. As simple as that. You will be added to our network mailing list, as well as any of the initiatives lists that you have joined, and we will send you updates about our events and our activities and how you can be more involved. One other way that you can follow what we're doing is we do have a Facebook page. Midwest Migration Network is the name. It is a closed group, so you do have to request to join. It's pretty easy to join though. Just answer a couple of simple questions and we'll let you in. So look for us on Facebook. And with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference and the rest of the program. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tom.
Great, thanks, Amber. That was amazing. It's like every time I listen to these talks, I say, wow, we've really come a long way in just a few years that the Midwest Migration Network has been going. Well, it's my pleasure right now to introduce our morning's keynote speaker, and that would be Dr. Pete Marra. Pete is most recently the director of the Georgetown Environment Initiative and Laudato Si Professor in Biology and the Environment at Georgetown. And that comes on the heels of a 20-year career with the Smithsonian Institution, the last several years of which Pete spent as director of the Migratory Bird Center. I first met Pete working with him on a study of direct anthropogenic mortality, and I've grown to know him as a solid friend as well as a comrade in birds, and he's a guy who, to be honest, seems to have his binoculars in just about every avian pie you can think of. And I use that metaphor because Pete's also a great cook. and a cook who will probably bring you stuff from his garden. He's a good gardener, or possibly some fish that he's caught. He's a great fisher person as well. But those, going back to those avian pies, well, full life cycle conservation, migratory connectivity, the effects of carryover on bird productivity and survival, urban bird programs like Neighborhood Nest Watch and Bird Friendly Coffee, and the list just goes on. He's got about 225 scientific papers that he's been an author on, and these document the science part of his work. But to me, I think his two books best sum up the breadth of Pete's work, working with birds and people. You go all the way from Birds of Two Worlds, which is about migratory connectivity and education around the birds of two worlds, and to Cat Wars, the devastating consequences of a cuddly killer. So a great breadth in Pete's work. Pete got started really early with birds as a lad of 6 years old in Norwalk, Connecticut, where he grew up. And I asked Pete, you know, oh, what was it? What was the bird that sort of got you going? And he just remembers really well that it was a mourning dove. He just one day just looked at this mourning dove and was kind of overtaken by the miracle of this bird. And he's been hooked on birds ever since. He began just hiking and biking everywhere he could go to see birds, local nature centers near his home. And he came to banding. His first experience with banding was through the black-capped chickadee, which is a bird that many of us hail as our favorite bird because of its pugnacious and friendly guidance to us. His early bicycle journeys brought him in touch with David Sibley and Noble Proctor, and it was through Noble Proctor that he did his undergrad at Southern Connecticut State University, after which he went on to LSU and worked in Peru for his master's degree. Met Ken Rosenberg in Peru at LSU, also in working with Ken in Peru, and the two of them have together co-evolved a magnificent career in bird work. He did some field work at Hubbard Brook and got his PhD at Dartmouth. So lots and lots of peregrinations throughout Pete's career, migrations. And so, you know, Pete, you probably better than anyone I know who can talk to us about bird migration, migratory connectivity, and what we can learn from birds as people, and what we can learn through migratory understanding in terms of doing bird conservation in a successful, efficient, and hopefully a very effective way. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Tom, thanks so much. Let me try to share my screen.
So now you want to
There you go.
Sorry about that. Knew that was going to happen. Well, thanks, Tom, so much. I really appreciate it. You know, one of the things that makes this all so worthwhile to me is the friendships we all make in ornithology and birding, in natural history. And I've been fortunate to have so many important mentors for me over the years, since a very young age, as well as so many close friends. So I really do appreciate it. And thank you so much for inviting me here this morning to talk to you about something I really enjoy talking about compared to something like cats. I really love talking about migration, migratory connectivity, and how we can use that fundamental science to address some of our greatest challenges we have in conservation. And we have some pretty big challenges. Many of the things I talk about will overlap with some of the things that Amber mentioned this morning. I love the themes that she talked about and the questions that she talked about. Those are the things that keep me up at night. So I think they're fantastic. It was probably when I was a young graduate student at LSU in 1987, when I first took a course. I think I was 22 years old. I took a course with a guy by the name of Al Meyer, who was a pretty well-known endocrinologist. He came from the Farner King labs, UW. And in that class, we learned a lot about, not just about broad endocrinology, but the importance of cycles and how cycles in physiology and biochemistry are really these clocks that keep on ticking, that make things go. And it was a very, very impressionable thing for me because it got me thinking about those cycles in ecology and in evolution and how pervasive these cycles are, not just in biological systems broadly, in ecosystems, but also in physical systems. And it starts with really the rotation of the tilted Earth around the sun that sets billions and billions of organisms into dark cycles, our sleep, our wake cycles, and as well as our seasonal cycles. And we go from spring to summer to fall to winter. And organisms that move around the world to keep basically into a constant summer or a constant spring, mainly driven by food. Not all, but many do this. And these cycles are really, really important. And it's these migrations, these spectacles that are so exciting to us and have captivated so many people for so many years that I think makes migration one of the most spectacular behaviors we see in nature. And I'm going to just jump right into a video just to sort of illustrate the tracking of a black-bellied plover and how exciting migration is. Start up on the north slope of Alaska in Marra. This is Autumn Harrison. She's the manager of the MIGRATORY Connectivity Project. Capturing a black-bellied plover outside of Marra and catching a 5-gram satellite tag. Down to the wintering grounds, where it spends November to March, early high sleep vanilla. And then starts its spring migration back. The Texas coast. Stages, building up fast north, where it makes this bigger jump back towards the Colville River Delta. Repeats again. We've actually tracked that same individual 5 years in a row. But we can pull out and we can look at multiple black-bellied plovers. And what's really astounding is how variable they are in the places they go. Spending about the same time on the wintering grounds, the bird going to Peru, coming back again, and all making it back again to their breeding grounds. There's a lot of biology that's represented in those movements. Sorry, apparently I couldn't be heard over the music, so I turned it down mid video. So hopefully that was okay for you guys. What's amazing is that in the US and Canada, most species are migratory. We estimate that it's around 75% of all species in the US and Canada that are migratory. What's unfortunate is that we're losing these epic migrations of birds for a whole suite of different reasons. Cerulean Warbler would be an example of a species that's experienced about a 75% decline over maybe the past 45 years. These are tracks from Raybuck et al. From geolocators. You can see a really interesting parallel migration from breeding grounds to wintering grounds. Rusty blackbird. These are some data that we've collected using geolocators deployed in Alaska with colleagues up there, in Alberta, and also in New Hampshire with several colleagues around the US and Canada. Student Jay Wright is pulling this together. Rusty blackbirds have experienced about a 90% decline. And another thing I want to emphasize is that we really don't know why they're declining. Another species is the Rufa subspecies of the red knot, experiencing about a 95% decline. Larry Niles has been working on this species for a long time, putting geolocators on them, using MODIS tags, a whole suite of things. Two different populations, mainly individuals that go all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, you can see here. Then there's another segment of that Delaware Bay population that goes down to Florida. But this species is experiencing pretty severe declines as well. And unfortunately, if you saw our paper that came out last spring, Ken Rosenberg is the lead, most species are declining. From 1970 to 2017, we've seen a net population loss of 2.9 billion birds since 1970. About a 30% total loss of abundance across the North American avifauna, US and Canada. That's 303 of 529 species, 57% of which are showing some sort of decline, specifically in grassland habitats, shorebirds, eastern forests, a whole suite of different habitats. The only group of birds that is fairly stable are waterfowl. Unfortunately, for most migratory birds on the planet, we haven't been able to follow them as they migrate, as they move. And if you can't follow them as they migrate and as they move, it's difficult to really understand where these individuals and where these populations go, and when and why and what is actually causing the mortality. It makes it very, very difficult. It does appear, as we look more and more, as though a lot of this mortality is occurring during that migratory phase. But the thing that we have to remember is that because we understand, and I'll talk more about this, that things like carryover effects and seasonal interactions are driving the mortality, it's difficult to say that, yes, it's migration itself that's causing the mortality, whereas it might be things that are occurring throughout the annual cycle, and they're just being manifested during this incredibly energetic phase of the annual cycle, that being migration. So today, this morning, I'm going to talk in more detail about annual cycles, and specifically the Migratory Connectivity Project, an effort I started in around 2009. I'll talk about the evolution and the miniaturization of a whole suite of different tracking tools this morning. And then I'll focus on 3 projects that I'm involved with, but are mainly being led by students and postdocs. We'll start off with a spring migration study along the Texas coast. This is a project that Emily Cohen and I started around 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I can't keep track. And the project that I'll focus on is being led now by a PhD student of Emily's, Claire Neens. And we'll talk about some pretty interesting Kirtland's Warbler movements, a project that's being led by Nate Cooper, a research associate at my lab, but he was a postdoc and a former student. But we're digging in deep into a really unique system with Kirtland's Warblers, thanks to MODIS tags. And finally, I'll stop with a study on yellow-billed cuckoo tracking using the lightest satellite tracking tags available, these 2-gram satellite tags. And that project is being led by Callie Stanley, and she is in Illinois right now, hopefully catching more cuckoos and attaching more tags. So this is the annual cycle of your typical land bird, and it's typical of a lot of different species. You can see the red being the breeding season, the black as you move from right to left on your screen, the black being fall migration, the green being the molt. It goes into the non-breeding season, which occupies the majority of the annual cycle, and then back into a spring migration, back into the breeding period. Well, since around 1989, I've been studying how different periods of the annual cycle interact, and we've shown in many different papers that these periods are inextricably linked. That what happens in the breeding season is not just driven by things during that breeding season, but it depends on how dry the previous winter was, what habitat those birds came from, the density of those populations on those overwintering grounds, and likely things that happen on the wintering grounds are probably influenced by things during that previous fall migration or during that previous breeding season, or if it was a first fledge or a second fledge. Many of these things are completely still unknown. But it's all likely that the things that you see in any given period of the annual cycle are driven by things, or in part driven by things in a previous cycle. So we can't just study things in the breeding season and hope to explain that variation without understanding where those birds came from or what they were exposed to. It doesn't make sense. But that's what we've done. And if you look at the literature, and we've published this in a paper, we've been extremely biased in when and where we study migratory birds, and actually birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. There's a severe breeding season bias in most research. Similarly, if we were to study things just during migration, we would be similarly biased, and we would be similarly unable to truly understand the variation that we're trying to explain within any of those one periods. So our goal needs to be really to sort of create those linkages to understand where those birds came from, what they were exposed to, etc. That's so essential to understand how the periods of the annual cycle are inextricably linked if we really want to understand the ultimate causation of a particular factor. So in 2009, I decided to start something called the Migratory Connectivity Project, which was devoted towards really advancing the conservation, but also the understanding of migratory animals throughout their full life cycle by increasing and sharing knowledge about migratory connectivity. It's a fairly simple idea. It's really just the geographic and temporal linking of individuals and population. So it's both geographic and temporal between different times of the year, including breeding, migration, and winter periods. It's individuals and its populations. It's that full annual cycle idea that we're trying to really promote here. Knowing migratory connectivity is essential. I can't overemphasize that. It basically provides us an understanding with more certainty of where, when, and why animals die. It tells us something about population vulnerability. If you have a particular population you're concerned about, you need to understand where that population is exposed to different threats. It's essential. It allows you to make these linkages and understand annual cycle dynamics, as I've just briefly mentioned, in ways that you couldn't do elsewhere. If you wanted to understand the impacts of climate change, you need to understand where those individuals and how those individuals are exposed to, say, differing precipitation regimes during the non-breeding season. If you then want to understand how those precipitation regimes in the non-breeding season might influence the survival of those individuals over the migratory journey or on the breeding grounds. If you want to understand the spread of disease, whether it's West Nile virus, avian influenza, or perhaps a tick-borne disease, you really need to understand where these birds are coming from and where they're going. And if you want to understand the impact of any stressor and whether or not that stressor has additive or compensatory mortality on a particular population, you need to really understand how these different animals are linked throughout the year. So the goals of the Migratory Connectivity Project are really to quantify the migratory connectivity for the birds of North America. And if you don't know, we've been working on a book for the last 7 years that is coming close to an end. It's called Discovering Unknown Migrations, the Atlas of Migratory Connectivity for the Birds of North America. It's a very large collaborative effort that involves colleagues from Cornell. And so we'll have all the eBird maps in this book. It involves folks from National Audubon Society. It'll have tracking data and complete migratory connectivity maps where they exist, but all the banding recapture data from the bird banding lab, et cetera. We're really excited about this, and it'll have wonderful artwork from John Anderton. That's coming along. We're also improving and helping to miniaturize tracking technology, getting the word out there about tracking technology, harness techniques. We're working on a paper right now that's really focused on a review of harness technology with Amy Scarpignano, Callie Stanley, and several other folks. We really want to make tracking tools more accessible, whether it's understanding their impacts or helping to understand the harness technology itself. And then to use this information to push domestic and international policy to the degree that we can. And then to create these compelling migration stories to inspire people to think more about migration and how we're all connected throughout that annual cycle, not just the birds, but also the people. That black-bellied plover story is one of those compelling migration stories. And we're doing one for common nighthawks now with some other colleagues. What's so exciting now is that animal tracking tools have evolved so rapidly, and they're truly revolutionizing the study of migration and also migratory birds. I'll talk specifically about banding. I'll talk a little bit about satellite transmitters, and then a variety of archival devices as well as nanotags. but they're becoming more and more miniaturized. Starting with the USGS Bird Banding Lab, which was created in the early 1900s with one of the goals of trying to figure out where these birds are going. But it's become such an invaluable tool for research and for management, for conservation, for a variety of things, not just for tracking birds as they move large distances, but probably more so for just looking at individual populations, both aluminum bands and color bands. There's very few things that I find more satisfying than tracking a color banded bird just by knowing that individual and watching it over space and time. That's one of my favorite things to do on the planet, is just to watch color banded birds. It's provided us so much fundamental information on all aspects of bird biology. It's really been an essential tool. The Bird Banding Lab has been around from 1914 to present, so it's over 100 years old. There have been close to 80 million birds banded now, and over 5.5 million re-encounters. You would have thought it would have been more than that, but the birds themselves are so small, and the spatial areas they move are just so large that it's taken over 100 years just to get 5 million re-encounters. So it's challenging. But the thing I want to emphasize is that I think of every bird that we capture as a living museum specimen, because we're taking data on these birds, and then if we recapture them, we get to sample them again. And when we sample these birds, we can improve their value by doing some things like sampling tissues, taking feathers, nails, and blood. Feathers can tell us things about isotopes. They can, what these birds have eaten, where they've been. Toenails can tell us the same thing. They can tell us about contaminant loads. Blood can tell us things about genotypes or contaminants or parasites that they might be carrying. You can then attach MODIS tags, as we're noticing, to see things about stopover duration. And I'll talk a little bit about Claire's work in that regard today. But they'll also, if you get a hit as the birds leave, they can tell you something about the connectivity in space and in time. By scanning the bird's feathers, you might be able to pick up some other ectoparasites. And then to the degree to which you can make that banding opportunity an educational experience, it does, to me, even more by sharing the wonder of birds with other individuals. So bird banding hopefully will never go away. I think it's a hugely important thing that we do as ornithologists, and I would just like to increase it tenfold if possible, frankly. But as time went on, we realized that bird banding and banding of individual animals wasn't sufficient. And it was the craigheads that I think of when I started thinking of how we were moving more into remote tracking technology, so we could start to understand how animals moved around the landscape almost continuously, not quite, but almost continuously. And the first attempt at this was a collar on a female elk in 1970, probably up in Yellowstone. It was 11 kilogram satellite transmitter, so it's not the kind of thing I'm about to put on a red start. But it wasn't too long after that we started to put on heavier satellite transmitters on things like swans and bald eagles and white pelicans like this, much heavier devices, but devices that transmitted to Argos satellites and then pinged us down at our desks drinking a glass of wine or having a cup of coffee. And then we moved into 5-gram satellite tags that allowed us to move into other species of smaller species like shorebirds, like this red knot, and now 2-gram satellite tags, which represent even the smallest tags out there that we've been attaching to yellow-billed cuckoos. People are attaching them to robins, to terns, a whole suite of different species. So they're still $5,000 a piece. They give us 1 ping a day, but the information is incredibly valuable, as I'll show you towards the end of the talk today. And then we've also, I think 10 or 12 years ago, have moved into these archival devices, light level geolocators, GPS tags that are also archival, but they give us different types of data with different levels of resolution. The downside is, of course, you've got to recapture the birds. And so the birds that die, we get no information from. And then there's also nanotags. So there's been this really remarkable revolution of tracking technology that's happened over the past, 30 years within our lifetimes that has changed our ability to interpret the biology of what these animals are doing. And to be honest, I'm not as interested myself in the technologies. I just use the technologies. What keeps me up at night, which really I'm passionate about, is using this technology to really uncover the biology of these animals. So let's talk a little bit more about MODIS, which is spreading like wildfire across the world. The smallest available devices here are 1/10 of a gram. These birds, once you put them on, they have a fairly long antenna on the back of the birds, and they've been used widely on not just on birds, but on bats and insects. But they have to fly through the radii of an antenna. It's like a 10 to 20 kilometer area around an antenna. If you look on the right-hand side of a slide, you can get an example of the antenna, and there's one right in the back of the picture here. They have very high temporal precision, so you know the minute that bird flies through that zone. The great thing is there's no need for recapture, and it all goes to a central data management location. There are now antennas in around, I think, 24 different countries. There might be over 600 different antennas that are deployed. You can see the northeastern US, it's pretty intense, but each of these yellow dots is a different antenna. They're essentially automated radio telemetry that we're seeing here. So MODIS is really moving forward in lots of ways. And then there's the exciting development of the ICARUS project led by Martin Wilkelski and a lot of other colleagues. It's the International Cooperation for Animal Research using Space. And it's an antenna, a dedicated animal telemetry antenna that is on the International Space Station. And this is now, it was just activated recently in the last 6 months. There are 6 active projects right now. We are going to be involved with tracking not just American robins, but the American robins this next year. 600 American robins will be tagged with 3.2 gram ICARUS tags. So those will be the smallest ICARUS tags. That's a project that's going to be led by a new PhD student, Emily Williams, but we'll be collaborating with folks like Alex Yan and several other folks around the US and Canada to really, get at the various movements throughout the annual cycle of robins. But we'll be trying to deploy these on a whole suite of different species as we try to uncover the various causes of mortality in some of these most declining species. And Martin is hoping to get the tag weight down closer to 2 and maybe ultimately 1 gram in the future. And the cost of these tags is, I think it's around $400 a piece. So that's a major advance, the degree to which we can do that. But we also need to remember that it's not just animal tracking tools, but we've also seen a revolution in animal movement tools in general. And so I'm not going to talk about these today, but Jeff Bueller and Emily Cohen and Adrian Doctor and several other folks, really leaders in the field, will be talking about how we can use radar technology to understand not the movement of individuals, but the movement of populations across space and time. And eBird is equally a transformational approach that uses citizen scientists to understand the movement of species over space and time. And I don't have acoustic monitoring up here too, but that could be added to our toolkit as another tool to look at how animals move. And it provides us a species level indication of movement, typically nocturnal movement. So things are pretty exciting in migration right now, in migratory bird ecology. So I'd like to now focus in on 3 projects where we're using a variety of these techniques to tackle different questions. Some of these are further along than others, but I just wanted to share them to give you an idea of how we're starting to deploy these. The first is at a spring migration banding site in Texas that Emily Cohen and I started in, I guess, 7 years ago. And we've published a whole suite of different papers on this. Claire Neems is a PhD student of Emily's who's going to be deploying MODIS tags and MODIS towers at these sites to look at stopover duration relative to connectivity and ask a whole suite of different questions. But in the old days, when we had to depend on recapture to look at stopover, now we can use this automated radio telemetry to do this. And this gives you an idea of our MISNet locations. This is right on the coast of Texas. And we have 4 different antennas up, or we did 4 different antennas 2 years ago. Because of COVID, we weren't able to have a season this past year, so these data are 2 years old. But we collect standard banding data at these sites, but we also collect blood samples to look at hemoparasites and sex birds. We look at ectoparasites. We're collecting fecal samples for gut microbiomes. And of course, we take feather and nail samples for stable isotopes And then we put nanotags on 3 species, at least we did in 2020, and we're going to continue to deploy nanotags on all these individuals. And by doing that, we can start to monitor these individuals across that space there. And you can see that if you're fat or you're lean, that determines whether you're a Swainson's thrush or an ovenbird, more so in the Swainson's thrush, obviously. If you're lean, your stopover duration is going to be longer than if you're fat. And doing this with MODIS tags really allows us to sort of ask these sorts of questions in ways that it would take probably multiple years if we were depending on just recapturing those same individuals with misnets. And you can also look at age effects and a whole suite of things that Claire's starting to dig in on that are pretty exciting at that site. Then you get on your knees and you pray that maybe these same individuals will be detected at other MODIS sites, and as the number of MODIS antennas increases, the probability of this detection will go up. But you can see that 10 of the different Swainson's thrushes were detected elsewhere. So you can get rate of migration and a variety of other things relative to the condition they were in, relative to the stopover duration. Again, you can put that single site into a seasonal interaction framework to start asking other questions about carryover effects, et cetera, that happened during that migratory stopover period. So really advancing our understanding of what's happening at migration. Now I'd like to jump into some of our work on Kirtland's warblers. We've been working on Kirtland's warblers for the last 15 years or so. Nate Cooper, who was a PhD student of mine and worked on red starts in Jamaica, came on and started working as a postdoc. He's now a research associate with me at Georgetown and at the Smithsonian. And Nate was involved initially with a geolocator study on Kirtland's warblers that allowed us to really start to refine our understanding of where these birds were moving throughout the annual cycle, where their migratory tracks were roughly. And you can see them here through that animation. But the neat thing about Kirtland's warblers and what allowed us to really do this next thing in this research is that they have this fairly restricted winter range in the Bahamas, primarily on 4 islands in the Bahamas, and a fairly restricted breeding area in the lower peninsula of Michigan, right here in that blue. And that allowed us to sort of isolate and put MODIS tags on birds in the Bahamas, and then MODIS tags on birds MODIS tags on the birds in the Bahamas, but then cover the entire breeding area with about 8 to 10 different antennas. And so when we put these tags on birds in the Bahamas, we can then track them over the winter period. But because we had a rough idea of where they were going because of geolocators during migration, we also had a series of towers there. We were able to detect them as they hit the coast of Florida. But let me back up a bit. We were actually able to detect 80% on departure from the Bahamas, and then around 40 to 50% of them as they hit the coast of Florida and moved up north on migration. And then 70% of those in Michigan. So what Nate and assistants did was basically, we would have these antennas that would detect an individual, that it was in that 10 to 15 kilometer circumference, then go out there with handheld radio telemetry equipment and locate the individual birds and start to track the nesting success of those birds. So we're actually tracking the same individual birds as they move from the wintering grounds through migration back up into the breeding areas. In all of our previous work, we've never been able to track the same individuals. In fact, very few studies track individuals like this from the wintering grounds to the breeding grounds. So they're actually working on the same individuals. So they would actually learn about the reproductive success of these birds, et cetera, on the breeding grounds. So this new system where we're using MODIS allows us to study direct carryover effects in the same individuals, really study migration survival. And I should point out that, we rarely miss a bird during one of those periods and detect it else at another time period, suggesting that if we miss it, the bird just really, it didn't die. It did die, and it was never detected later. And it's also allowing us to look at migration phenology in ways that we really haven't been able to before. Because when a bird goes through that tower circumference, we are getting movement to the exact minute. And we actually also know when it leaves the wintering grounds, the exact time that it leaves the wintering grounds to head off on migration. So pretty cool temporal precision. The neat thing is that when we track these, when we tag these birds on the wintering grounds, we don't know who we're tagging. So we don't know, we know if we're tagging males or females, but we don't know if we're tagging floaters or truly territorial birds. So this is the population of birds in the upper lower peninsula of Michigan. The black points are the antennas. The different octagons are the suitable habitat for Cerulean warblers. And we're seeing the white bird, the white dashed birds are birds coming in that are typical territorial breeders. And the colored birds are birds that are actually using an alternative space use strategy. So they've all come in. Now it's incubation time. Birds have pretty much settled. We've got a few late stragglers coming in. And then we're going to see something very unusual that's going to happen. This is a paper that's in press in Current Biology. We're going to see true floater behavior. These colored birds, right at the time that nestlings start to feed, hatching is done, we see some individuals that start to move. And what we've done is these tagged floaters, because Nate and his crew have discovered that these birds that are colored are actually mostly not breeders. They've never had a nest. Those are the individuals that are moving. And they're moving up to 60 to 70 kilometers. Some of them are moving at night. They're all males. A few of them are actually breeders, 9%. 2 of those are males. There actually was 1 female, 1 successful breeder, but most of them were failed breeders. So there's this movement that's happening, this secretive behavior that we've really never been able to see like this before. And we can only see because of this automated telemetry around the entire breeding range, or 95% of the breeding range for this species. So it's pretty cool. And again, the scale of these movements are 10, 20, 60 kilometers. Fairly interesting. So the last thing I want to talk about is a project that's being led by Callie Stanley, a postdoc in my lab. And yellow-billed cuckoos, if you're not aware, are a species that are declining dramatically throughout their entire range. Western cuckoos have all but almost disappeared, but eastern yellow-billed cuckoos are also crashing. But because we have these 2-gram satellite tags, we've been able to deploy them on yellow-billed cuckoos for the first time. And Callie deployed 5 satellite tags on several different populations around the US. We're doing it again this year in Illinois. We were delayed because of COVID, but you can see here, this is an individual that she tagged last year, took off. Now we're gonna watch the animation of these yellow-billed cuckoos from several different sites. There are Western populations and Eastern populations. Right now it's mid-July. One of the things that we discovered that these birds, even during the middle of the breeding season, are moving regionally at scales that we never imagined before. But watch how the Eastern population just sort of takes off, heads south into South America, trans-Gulf, across the Caribbean. The Western population coming a little bit later, ends up going a little bit further south than the Eastern population. Some random movements, and they come back down. But one of the things that was just so dramatic to us was the fact that these cuckoos from across the range occupied this fairly small range within the wintering area of cuckoos. You can see this sort of traditional old school range map has the winter range all throughout South America. But when we track cuckoos from 5 different populations, this is the winter range that we discovered. It's much more refined. I'm not suggesting that cuckoos aren't wintering in a few more of these areas because we've got other populations to track, but birds from Illinois, Texas, Arizona, Tennessee all seem to go down in that area. It's also interesting to note that these, and it's a small sample size for sure, but these Western cuckoos tended to be in the south, and the Eastern cuckoos tended to be up into Bolivia and northern Paraguay. Those Western cuckoos were down in Argentina. And if we look at what's happening with some remote sensing down in that area of Paraguay, unlike the part in Bolivia, there's been massive amounts of tree cover loss, mainly due to agriculture from Mennonites in that area. And this is an area that's been covered in the literature and in the press. This is massive amounts of deforestation happening in the Gran Chaco It's really unfortunate, but it's looking like this level of deforestation might be what's partially responsible for the decline of those cuckoos. But this is something that we're going to continue to look into in much more depth. But an example of how that the tracking data was really essential in helping us understand a little bit more about where those birds went, and using a retrospective analysis to understand what was happening with land use in those areas. So I hope I've made it clear that it's really, if we want to understand the biology of these birds, and if we want to put that biology into a conservation application, it's really essential that we put whatever system you're looking at, whatever period of the annual cycle, into a full annual cycle context to understand that broader idea. Ultimately, we want to be thinking about a full life cycle context, but baby steps. It'll be happening. A first step in that is really identifying the migratory connectivity. So you're working with at least linked populations, if not the same individuals throughout the annual cycle. So you're removing any potential biases or variants that's not really relevant to your study system. Halting these declines that we're seeing in birds and determining when, where, and why mortality is occurring is really dependent on our ability to look at that migratory connectivity. Yes, mortality might be highest during migration. I bet it is. I think it is in most of the systems I'm working in. But I also know from some of our studies that that mortality is highest after really dry winters, or if those birds are coming from really, really poor habitats. So there's clearly a seasonal interaction that's happening there that ties this all together. And ultimately, what's clear is that it's not going to be one technique that's going to get us to our final answer, whatever our final answer is. It's going to really be combining these different approaches, whether it's eBird with acoustic or radar technology, or it's banding of individuals with MODIS towers, or whatever it happens to be, physiology with 2-gram satellite technologies. It's that integration of different techniques, interdisciplinary approaches, that's going to provide us with the largest advances in biology, as well as in our ability to implement effective conservation on the ground. So I'd be happy to take some questions. I apologize for the screw up early on, but hopefully that was interesting to you all.
Wow, that's great, Pete. I mean, it's really impressive to me. First, there's that miracle of migration. It's sort of impressive how science has co-evolved with, just gotten better and better. And as we learn more and more about, what's driving migration and what's driving bird mortality and bird survival, the miracle actually grows rather than shrinks. I mean, it's kind of, the technology, especially the individual tracking, sort of makes individual birds seem like even more marvelous creatures than they were before. It's just so cool to realize that. We don't have a lot of time for questions, and I see that Nate has answered a couple questions that came in. I just want to remind everybody that if you have questions, can put them in the chat, and even if we don't have time to get to them verbally, we'll figure out a way to get back to you either as a group or individually later. I guess, are there, we've seen these amazing animations on eBird. Is there an easy place to go to see some of this tracking information that's evolved other than eBird itself? Like to look at, is there a collective place where we can view these amazing movies of bird migration?
So on the Migratory Connectivity website, we have several different animations there. But I think one of the coolest place to go look at animations is if you go to 422 South, which is the company that helped us do the animation. And one of the most exciting animations that they have is one of honey buzzards. If you all haven't seen the honey buzzard animation, pour yourself a glass of wine and go watch the honey buzzard animation. I think I've watched it 100 times. They've done some really amazing work and putting things into the bird's eye perspective. So, and there's lots of other animations out there. And they're getting more and more refined and more exciting. So I'm seeing some of the chat. I apologize. I've never done the animation over Zoom, so I didn't know we couldn't hear my voice over that. music.
Yeah, Nate Cooper also mentioned, check out the at Migratory Connectivity on Twitter, and there'll be stuff there. Stephanie just posted the honey buzzard migration tool.
Okay, good. And Nate's paper that we have coming out in Current Biology should be out in 4 to 6 weeks, and there's going to be an actual animation in the paper. And Nate will also have a verbal abstract that he can share, that you can share in that paper. So Current Biology, keep your eyes peeled.
Pete, what do you think is the single most exciting thing on the frontier with our understanding of migratory connectivity and bird migration?
Well, I think ICARUS, having just gone live, really is it's just the icing on the cake. Really, it's going to revolutionize and allow us to track birds that we haven't, and other animals, just because of the price point. But it's hard to, as exciting as that is, as I mentioned, just how this has all moved along in the last 20 years is really incredible. And the insights it's provided us has really changed our understanding of how we watch birds, how we track individuals, where those individuals go, how we share these birds. It's important now that our conservation policies catch up with this. With this information. That's really where we need to go. That's the next frontier. As we're forced into revising our policies like MBTA and other things. These are truly international birds, and things that we do to them, just like I showed with the yellow-billed cuckoo on their winter grounds, have total impacts on us here. So any of these birds that we're studying in the Midwest, as you guys all know, are impacted by things happening throughout the annual cycle.
Yeah, just one last question, Pete. Are there particular species that we should target for study via nanotags or other devices?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so a whole parallel world where Tom and I and others are working on identifying sort of the top tier species from the science paper we had that are in need of additional biological information, so we can start to figure out why these birds are dying, what the limiting factors really are. And so, Tom, where's the best place to send people so they can see the list of 47 species?
I guess I'll have to post that in the chat, when we make that file available.
Yeah, so there actually is a prioritization that we're creating, but unfortunately there's a lot of species that we should be tagging. And so adding MODIS tags to your studies at banding stations can really be a wonderful thing to add to your research projects. Great.
Well, thanks, Pete. That was just really awesome. Hopefully you'll be able to answer a couple other questions in the chat or hang around a little bit for the rest of the period. Maybe you can join one of the groups later. I know you're really busy, but I really appreciate you taking time out to share with us. It's been just fantastic.
My pleasure, and enjoy the rest of the conference, everybody.
Thanks. I want to move on today for the next section of today's program, and that's to introduce everybody to the 4 Midwest Migration Network initiatives and their leaders, which you'll learn more about those initiatives and have an opportunity to meet with their leaders later on in the week. They include the banding and ground surveys led by Mark Shieldcastle, the Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition led by Joel Merriman, the telemetry group led by Sarah Kendrick, and then Jeff Bueller working with radar and acoustics. So we'll hear first from Mark Shieldcastle. Mark's currently the research director at Black Swamp Bird Observatory in Ohio, and I don't know this for sure, but I bet Mark has probably banded more birds than all of us put together over his life, probably many thousands, maybe even 10,000s, starting with northern pintail and American woodcock. So Mark, take it away and tell us a little bit about your initiative and what we have in store for the rest of the conference.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I'll try to do the screen share here and see if I have any luck on this. and just so that you don't have to look at me. Just throw this up there. I want to thank Tom for getting us going here, and also want to thank Peter for what was a very excellent presentation, and really I think kind of covered all the real purposes why the MMN was even started. I have taken on the initiative of the Land Bird Migration Initiative, ground surveys, which includes banding. It's kind of centered around banding, but there's more than it than just banding. We have developed a protocol to accomplish, primarily the objective is to gather standardized data to inform multiple questions at multiple levels. One of the real problems in migration has been there's been no real standardization. Everybody's doing their own things, and then when you go to try to answer big question problems such as are facing the birds today, it's very hard to accomplish that because it's apples and oranges. So that was really what started the banding initiative. What I'll be going over today is some of the objectives that we hope to get from that and get started. We're doing it in the Midwest region, the Great Lakes region, but it has potential to be going across the nation, actually. A co-presenter with me today in this afternoon's session will be Antonio Celis Marra, who is the acting chief of the bird banding laboratory. He's going to be kind of hopefully giving an idea of the direction, what the banding lab sees in the future, and how these initiatives are going to be very important to the overall banding program for the really the hemisphere. So we'll be starting with the objectives, the big picture review from the banding lab, and then we're going to go into the protocols themselves. On the slide that's up on your screen is the actual location on the network's website for the protocol. It's a very detailed protocol. It's multi-leveled, allows a lot of flexibility, and that's what we tried to build into it. And we'll be going over that protocol and some of the real reasons and primary standardizations that just need to be required. So that's, I think, pretty much what we were hoping to accomplish this afternoon for you. Hopefully it'll generate more interest, not just from the Midwest region, maybe across the country. We're definitely interested in talking, if anyone, on our reasons and the protocols, and working very closely with the banding lab and the next generation of bandit to ensure that these big projects such as the migration initiative, MAPS, which is a breeding initiative, and mostly which is a wintering initiative, are part of the future in the banding lab's directions. So that pretty much, I think, is all I have. Let's see if I can figure out how to get off of this.
Great, Mark. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
I guess next we'll hear from Joel Merriman, who is the director of American Bird Conservancy's Bird Smart Wind Energy Campaign. Hi, hey Joel.
Hi.
And Joel will be speaking about the Great Lakes Wind and Wildlife Coalition. I think even though his very first bird trip with Barney Dunning logged a mere 34 species, Joel's been at it ever since. White-breasted nuthatch, I think you told me, popped out as one of your formative bird experiences at the age of 14. So take it away and tell us about the Wind Wildlife Coalition.
Thank you, Tom. And that is absolutely all true. The thing that really blew me away about my first birding trip was to find out that there was more than one species of sparrow. I mean, who knew? So, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Tom, for the introduction. I'm here to talk about the newest initiative of the Midwest Migration Network, the Great Lakes Wind Wildlife Coalition. I'm Joel Merriman. I'm the initiative leader. I'm also, as Tom said, the Bird Smart Wind Energy Campaign Director at American Bird Conservancy. And since we are the new kid on the block, I'm very excited to tell you what it is that we're up to and how we plan to get there and how we plan to go about it. So Of course, since we're new, the first and most obvious question is, why do we need a wind wildlife coalition? And there's a lot of answers for this, but I thought it would be helpful to start with just a quick overview of the wind energy build out in the US. What we have here, this is an image from the US wind turbine database. This is a collaboration between USGS, the American Wind Energy Association, and the Berkeley Lab. And this shows where all of the currently active wind turbines are in the US. And you can see that there are some really obvious clusters here. A lot of that is along the Great Plains. That's where the wind energy resources and really developable land are the most abundant. You've got some clusters in the Northwest in Appalachia, but also you can see that there are a fair few in the Illinois and Indiana area. There's a few in Michigan and a few in upstate New York. So what we've got at this point is somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 turbines that have been built. They're currently operating in 41 states. There's at least one more in the works in Virginia, which would make it 42. And we are currently at about 106 gigawatts of capacity. That's all onshore. When we're looking at offshore in the United States, to this point, there is one operating facility. This is 5 turbines off the coast of Block Island in Rhode Island. So there's quite a bit more coming in the pipeline in the offshore realm, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. In considering the prognostication for how much we expect to see this industry grow, this is from the Department of Energy, looking at what was a few years back, the projections for how much wind energy we were going to see in each of the states in the United States. This is what's projected for 2020, so this year. And as you can see, it was anticipated to be 113 gigawatts. We're fairly close to that, so that actually proved to be a pretty good estimate. One thing I'll point out is all of the green in these pie charts, those are the onshore wind facilities, and blue is the offshore wind facilities. And so this is moving forward to their projection for 2050. It accounts to a more than tripling of the amount of capacity of wind turbines total. And as you can see, there are certain states that are expected to have quite a bit more than others. But again, you can see along the coasts, in particular along the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast, you see a fair bit of offshore, but then you do see some offshore in the Great Lakes region as well. I mentioned briefly earlier the amount of build out that's expected along the oceanic coasts. Won't spend too much time on this because obviously it's outside of the scope of our group, but and we'll hear more about this tomorrow from one of our speakers, but this is these are the facilities that are expected along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. And zooming into our earlier DOE figure, this just is a closer look at how much is expected in the Great Lakes, Wisconsin, Michigan, quite a bit in Ohio, and New York, and some in Pennsylvania. So all of this obviously is a good thing. We need renewable energy and wind energy to combat climate change and reduce carbon emissions and hopefully reduce and reverse some of the really harmful effects this is going to cause to birds, bats, and other wildlife. But like many things, this does not come without environmental costs. And not to spend too much time on this, but there were a trio of studies published around 2012 that estimated the number of birds that were killed annually by wind turbines in the US, came to somewhere between 234,000 and 573,000. Obviously, there's been a considerable amount of build out since then, but no real updated estimates of mortality as yet. Studies were similarly published around the same time for bats. This is unclear. There was quite a bit of variability here. The estimates ranged from somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 to 900,000 bats each year. In the offshore realm, which is of course what we're primarily interested in for the coalition, there are far fewer studies of collisions. And part of this is because it's just incredibly difficult to study collisions in the offshore realm. which we'll hear more about tomorrow, but obviously it's far more difficult to walk around underneath the turbine and look for bird carcasses. There are other effects in the offshore realm, including displacement effects, barrier effects, which again, we'll hear more about tomorrow from Kate Williams. And one of the most important things in all of this is that the bird and bat impacts of wind facilities can be minimized with smart science-based planning. And that's really where the Great Lakes Wind Wildlife Coalition comes from, is to try to get ahead to the extent possible of wind energy build out in the Great Lakes and the offshore realm to ensure that this development minimizes impacts. So the coalition started organization sometime in early 2019, and it consisted of a series of discussions just trying to figure out what needed to be done, what the issues were, and how we were going to approach actually working on this. Our statement of purpose that we ultimately arrived at, which I believe Amber read earlier, is to minimize the impacts of offshore wind facilities to birds and bats by proactively informing and providing guidance for project planning in the Great Lakes. So a lot going on in there, but this is about being proactive and about providing the right science, the right guidance, the right information to enable other people to make decisions that keep these impacts to a minimum. We were integrated with the Midwest Migration Network in January of 2020, which we're very excited about. This was a real win-win for both groups. For our purposes, we're able to work with the network. We're able to work with all of the various folks with different expertise that bring a lot of different things to the table on this question. And from the MMN side, obviously these initiatives have compiled so much great information and are continuing to do so much good work. This is a real opportunity to apply that to a real contemporary issue right in the backyard of the network. And it was ultimately organized, the coalition was ultimately organized out of the need for this kind of information. So we're organized around two committees. The first is the Bird and Bat Science Committee. This is focused on compiling the available information about bird and bat use of the Great Lakes, synthesizing this, identifying data gaps, and then finding the right ways to apply this in terms of how to identify the sites that are going to have the least amount of impact on bird and bats. Our committee chair is Dave Luukkonen at Michigan State University. We have a best management practices committee, which is focused on finding the right science-supported best management practices that are available that we know that will avoid, minimize, or otherwise mitigate impacts to bird and bats as we're developing these offshore wind facilities. Both committees have met once. We are new, so they've both met for the first time within the last couple of weeks. Everybody's very excited about where we're going with this. We've got great teams assembled already, but part of what we're doing now is just making sure we have all the right expertise, all the right representation in terms of institutions at the table. So a lot of our first committee meetings were focused on roster building and prioritizing actions. One thing that's very important about this initiative is we have absolutely no intent to reinvent the wheel. There's already a lot of good resources out there for all of this. Among those are the Fish and Wildlife Service land-based wind energy guidelines. This is obviously for onshore, but it provides a framework that's very useful. In 2011, Dave Ewert and the Nature Conservancy published Great Lakes Regional Guidelines for wind energy development. There was also a massive effort on the part of the Great Lakes Commission. It was called the Great Lakes Wind Collaborative. This was active for about a decade. It ceased to be active here just a couple of years ago, but they have a lot of good resources and information, including offshore sighting principles. This is not specific to birds or bats, but good information for us to build on. And also a Great Lake Wind Atlas, which synthesized and organized some of that science. But one of the most important things for our purposes currently is this affiliation with the Midwest Migration Network. And again, all the great expertise and skills that are represented. So we are new and we are looking for additional participation. So we'd certainly like to have you all listen in on our session, which is tomorrow morning. To give a quick overview of that, we have two primary speakers. One is Kate Williams. She's the Wildlife and Renewable Energy Program Director at Biodiversity Research Institute. She has a considerable amount of expertise and has been at the table for a long time with the Atlantic Coast offshore wind energy development planning. And so she has a lot of good information to provide about offshore wind power and volant wildlife, looking at what we know about best management practices, what we know about impacts, and generally how those conversations are proceeding on the Atlantic coast, where we have more than 25 gigawatts of projects in the pipeline. She'll be followed by Elise Zipkin. She's an associate professor of ecology and conservation biology at Michigan State University. And she'll be presenting on some work that she did with Allison Sussman, looking at methods to identify waterbird hotspots. Just the different ways that can be approached, what that entails, and what kind of data that needs. So thank you all, and very excited to be taking this initiative on, and look forward to seeing all of you at the session tomorrow.
Thanks, Joel. One question that popped up is, are there similar efforts going on in Canada, and is the development in Canada equal to, greater than, or less than in the US, and especially around the Great Lakes?
The development in Canada was actually ahead of the curve at one point. They had a couple of projects that were being planned and were nearing actual approval and installation in Ontario years back. Ultimately, the Ontario government put a moratorium on offshore wind energy development to collect additional science and information to inform that process. And the thought is that a lot of this boils down to what happens with the icebreaker project on Lake Erie off the coast of Cleveland. So, so we shall see.
Great, thanks. Very much appreciated. You know, thanks for reminding us. Folks who want to learn more about wind energy and the coalition can tune in tomorrow morning at 10:30 Eastern, 9:30 Central. And I did not mention, although Mark did mention it, that folks who want to learn more about the banding initiative and the protocols that are being developed and some of the things in the future of bird banding in the upper Midwest should attend the session this afternoon. That starts at 1:30 Eastern, 12:30 Central, and you're all welcome to that. To come to that, we will probably end this program this morning at on the hour, and we'll ask you to sort of sign out of the Zoom, but you can sign in with the same Zoom link for all the other sessions in the entire conference, actually. So we look forward to your participation then. Thanks. Okay, next up we have Sarah Kendrick, who's right now the state ornithologist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. Sarah leads the telemetry working group for the Midwest Migration Network. She came to birds later in life than some of us, although not all. And but she came with fury, because when she took an ornithology course as a prep for a change in life in grad school, her life itself was changed. Her eyes were open to the world of birds, and she's never looked back since. So Acadian flycatcher was, I think, the lead character in her first field job, and her first bird in the hand was a brilliant male indigo bunting. And you know, what more can I say? An indigo bunting, right? Yes. So tell us a little bit about what's going on with radio telemetry, Sarah. Thanks.
Yes, I would be happy to. Thank you, Tom. Hello, everybody. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
It's working. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Kendrick. As Tom said, I'm the state ornithologist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. I've been the telemetry initiative lead for not even a year. I think a year next month. No, maybe it's a year this month. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But I'm fairly new to the Midwest Migration Network, but it's been a really invaluable source for me regionally to work on MODIS and get involved. I first learned about MODIS in 2018 at a Partners in Flight meeting in Costa Rica. It's where I also first met Tom. And I was approached by long-term partners in Nicaragua, and they said, we want to put a MODIS receiver on our reserve. And I said, what's a MODIS receiver? So since then, in the last 2 years, it's really ramped up. I've become a big proponent of MODIS. I think it's amazing. It was really nice to hear Pete talk about just the majesty and miracle of migration, because I just think it's fascinating. And I love the collaborative nature of MODIS. And so I'm all in helping however I can, putting up MODIS receivers in Missouri and across the Midwest. So that's a little bit about me. For the telemetry initiative, you can see here pictures that Pete showed some of these, and Amber talked about some of this too, but tagging not just birds, but also bats and large insects. Really, the initiative is working to expand that mobile radio telemetry tracking and the network of MODIS stations throughout the region. So increase MODIS across Region 3 and beyond. So we hope to be a resource for folks beyond those borders, but really trying to ramp it up in the Midwest specifically. We have some catching up to do compared to the Northeast, so I'm ready for it. We need more. So 2 years ago, I think last year or the year before, I gave 15 presentations about MODIS to people in Missouri. That was to Audubon chapters, anyone who's interested really, master naturalist groups. And I love talking about MODIS because it's one of the few areas where lay people can contribute directly to research. They can donate to MODIS or they can donate to our Heritage Foundation account at the department. We have an account just for MODIS to put up MODIS receivers. And so it's really kind of a unique, fun topic to introduce people to, as Pete did, talk about banding and the different types of tracking birds and how this is new and revolutionary. So 2 years ago, I show this map and very cheekily say, you may notice a gap across the entire Midwest. In the 2 years since I made this slide, this has happened. So you see all of this influx of many, many MODIS receivers across the Midwest. I'll show you again because I think it's cool. But especially up around the Great Lakes, and also in the middle of the Midwest, you can see we're trying on our southern line here across our Ozarks. We're working on a northern line across Missouri, but just trying to ramp up these receivers across the whole region, not just Missouri. So this is our Midwest Migration Network Strategic MODIS Receiver Plan. It is very pie in the sky, but it runs along latitudinal lines, strategic lines, so that we can capture birds moving north-south during migration. It also runs along major rivers and along major water bodies like the Great Lakes. And so you can see we're trying to fill in along those lines, but many states approach me or the Midwest Migration Network or other people who are doing MODIS, who they just heard are doing MODIS, that ask them, well, where should I put a receiver? What do I buy? What do I do? How much does it cost? A lot of technical questions. And so this is what we point them to. If you are able to, place one in these latitudinal lines or along this general path. So I took a sneaky screenshot from Pete's presentation to show that our very first pilot MODIS receiver in Missouri there in the middle in Jeff City detected one of their Swainson's thrushes. So just imagine if this existed, how many more of those birds and many other studies would be detected. So that's really the impetus behind us trying to ramp up, putting up many more receivers in the Midwest. So I would be remiss to not show, I realized here I'm only showing part of Mexico and Central America and only part of South America, but these are really our only MODIS receivers in Central America along a lot of those stopover sites. Clearly we need many more in South America as well, but I know that we focus on the Midwest, but always try with placing more of these if you have connections or an ability to purchase and work with partners to place more on those stopover sites and wintering grounds. That is just as important as up in the Midwest. So I always try and plug that too. So this is my teaser about encouraging everybody to come to our session on Wednesday afternoon. We have great speakers. We have our head honcho, Stu McKenzie, who works for Bird Studies Canada. He is in charge of MODIS. He's the MODIS director of MODIS. And so he will be speaking us to the group, giving an intro to MODIS, answering questions. It'll be a brief kind of high level introduction. I'm going to talk about our efforts to broaden MODIS in the Midwest in particular as part of the Midwest Migration Network, a few big grants that we've applied for that would really try and broaden the network. Rich Keith with Kalamazoo Bird Observatory will talk to us about expanding MODIS in Michigan. We will hear from Annie Bracey talking about common tern tracking using MODIS in Minnesota. And then Chris Tonner's worked with MODIS for a long while in Ohio. So we'll hear from him about some research that he has worked with the students at Ohio State. And then again, we'll be re-showing that brief video of that Kirtland's warbler movements that Pete showed us. Nathan Cooper kindly shared that with us to show during our session. So if you would like to see that again, come to our session. And then we're gonna have a lightning round where people can chime in and just for a few minutes say who you are and how you've been working to broaden MODIS, or if you have interest or what your plans are. really, we want this session to be a jumping off point for more collaboration and networking within the Midwest for MODIS. And then we'll have some time for remaining questions. There's always questions about MODIS and how it works and new technologies, and some discussion on if there are burning topics or areas of study that we really want to focus on in the Midwest. We really, again, I've talked to Stu a lot about just the speakers here and what we'd like to accomplish in this session. And really, we do feel that it would be a great jumping off point for more collaboration across the region. So again, join us to learn about current research, future receiver placement and coordination of that placement, future MODIS research projects. I'll talk a little bit more about that big grant we've put in for, which would broaden MODIS quite a bit across the region and on those stopover sites and wintering grounds. And again, to just begin a discussion on regional collaboration of receivers and projects. So again, this is a jumping off point, and we'll see you tomorrow at 12:30 Central. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That's awesome. Awesome growth. That's I love that slide that shows MODIS towers several years ago and MODIS towers today.
In 2 years, it really is. It is taken off.
And think of the information. 2 years, 3 years down the line, what we'll get.
Absolutely.
That's great. Yeah, once again, please join our initiative leads in their respective sessions. You'll see that Stephanie's doing a great job posting desires for re-registration or registrations if you haven't clicked on the little radio buttons for each session, and the same link will get you into those workshops as well. Thanks, Sarah, especially for making the point, although I'll sort of add to it, that our Midwest birds are also birds of Central and even Northern South America, so that putting up MODIS towers in Mesoamerica is really like completing that full life cycle for the birds that we hold near and dear in our little part of the world. So it's really not just, really Midwest is everywhere because the birds take us there.
It's true, the birds bring us together.
Thank you. I just want to make one little call out to Sarah's predecessor, Brad Jacobs, who recently passed away. Brad was just an amazing presence in the Midwest with Partners in Flight in Missouri and throughout the Midwest and internationally as well, in terms of being, I think, one of the great leaders in making states in particular aware of their responsibilities for stewardship in terms of working in the non-breeding season, working across the migratory circle and migratory cycle. And, I know Brad was a really special person for me, and I want to encourage everybody to go online on the Partners in Flight website and read the celebration of Brad's life that folks have put up there and authored. And thank you, Sarah, for carrying on Brad's legacy. That's great.
Yeah, Brad was a big proponent of this, as many of you know, and he told me he was very proud of the work in a different way that we were doing for MODIS, and that was very special. So yeah, he would be proud.
All righty, thanks. Okay, the last initiative lead we'll hear from today would be Jeff Bueller, and he leads our final working group, the Radar and Acoustics Initiative. So any of us put together, although the birds that Jeff has seen may be disguised as blips on a NexRad radar screen. So welcome, Jeff, and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I hope everyone can hear me. And can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we're good.
Good. All right. Perfect. So, and I should add, we've been reflecting on sort of these, the birds that got us into studying birds or interested in ornithology. And as a radar ornithologist, we also need to reflect on, that first radar image that we saw that really jazzed us about radar ornithology. And for me, it was in 1998, I was a master's student at LSU and went over to University of Southern Mississippi to see Sid Gautreaux give a talk about studying bird migration on NexRad. And that's what really got me hooked on radar ornithology. And the Radar and Acoustics Initiative, we are a sort of a very loose group of I think there's about 24 people sort of in our email list, doing work in the region on, studying bird migration with radar and acoustic tools. And I think what makes these tools stand out from bird banding or telemetry, and Pete alluded to this earlier, is that it's sort of looking at bird migration at a different scale, right? Especially for these large weather surveillance radars, where we can kind of look across the continent and just get sort of comprehensive coverage of what's going on during the night or even during the day in regards to bird migration, and be looking at sort of the aggregate biomass of all these birds of many different species moving at the same time. And the acoustics also gives us an opportunity, well, both of these, to peer into the night, right? To really be able to see what's happening or listen to what's happening overhead during the night, and be able to identify different bird species. Those that give flight calls at night, we can identify those flight calls to species. And what I wanted to do before I gave a preview of the speakers in our session, that'll be Thursday morning, was to go over some highlights of studies that have been published in the last 3 years since we last met as a network back in 2017. So on work that's been done by members of the initiative and just other researchers that are sort of working in this general region. So the first of these is a paper from led by Kevin Heist and the group of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service researchers out of Bloomington, Minnesota. And they've been deploying these portable marine radars at different places. This one, this study was of data collected along the shoreline of Lake Michigan, and just looking at traffic rates along shorelines compared to inland areas, like 20 kilometers away from these shorelines, and just trying to compare traffic at different times of the day, and in particular, sort of this dawn activity within the hour surrounding dawn. And some of the takeaway findings that they found was that overall shoreline activity is about 27% greater than inland activity, and over all time periods, and especially during the dawn, it's 132% greater in that hour at dawn relative to more inland areas. And then we have a study led by Paul Tuck and a group out of Bowling Green State University, where they're also employing thermal imaging. So we haven't sort of called out thermal imaging as a tool, but I kind of throw it in with radar and acoustics, right? So because it's sort of a remote sensing technique that allows us to observe nocturnal migration. And they were comparing movements of birds during morning flight, just from ground surveys, visual surveys, to the orientation of flight from the weather surveillance radars during the night, and found that this sort of west-northwest movement of birds along the southwest shore of Lake Erie, and which is different. The morning flight directions are sort of, parallel to the shoreline, kind of going around the west end of Lake Erie, compared to the movement at night, which is more to the northeast of birds crossing the lake. This is during spring migration. And so they think, there's sort of this complex interaction of motivators, being compensation for wind drift, come morning, searching for suitable stopover habitat, and flying in a direction that's going to minimize sort of any loss in progressing north during the spring and avoiding the lake crossing. And then another paper from this same group, led by David Gisecki, again looking at this Doppler radar out of Cleveland, Ohio, and comparing that to, I think this was thermal imaging orientation at different points along the southwest shore of Lake Erie. And again, they found that birds along the southwest coast of Lake Erie are predominantly oriented towards the northwest during spring, which sort of differs from the more northeasterly broad front direction of migration that's seen by the weather surveillance radars to the south of the lake. And as the nights progress, they found that, you know, this northeasterly broad front migration sort of direction diminished towards this more northwest general direction of the coastline. So some interesting, we can use these tools to look at some of the migration strategies of birds, right, when confronting some of these ecological barriers or obstacles like the Great Lakes. And moving on to some acoustic studies, we have Zach Gack at University of Windsor, who's been working on his dissertation studying movements of birds over the Lake Superior and using acoustic microphones to listen and identify species moving over different areas of the lake. And they published a paper which is really interesting, sort of developing an array of microphones to get three-dimensional information about birds flying over. So not only listening and being able to identify species composition, but also to get some information about the height that different species are flying through acoustics. And it looks like they're getting very good accuracy, you know, within a meter or two, being able to determine the flight heights of birds that are calling as they're flying over. And then I also want to mention this study that has come out of a group led by Ben Winger at University of Michigan, and includes the Cleveland Museum of Natural History and the Field Museum in Chicago, looking at bird collisions. And this is not necessarily an acoustic study, although, you know, birds are it's related to nocturnal flight calls of birds. And it's a really cool study that was done in the region, so I wanted to highlight it. But they were collecting data, bird collisions at McCormick Place, which is what's pictured here. I believe that's what's pictured there in Chicago. And this is data going back to 1978. So employees of the Field Museum would walk the building every morning during spring and fall migration and collect birds from 1978 to 2016 is the data set. And the Chicago bird collision monitors started monitoring birds in 2002, and there was collision monitoring beginning in 2017 in Cleveland by their Lights Out group. And so one of the things that came out of this large data set of collisions is that species that produce these flight calls during nocturnal migration tend to collide more with buildings, more than those species that don't make flight calls. And also these species that make flight calls show stronger attraction response to artificial light. So more collisions in places that at a very local scale are much brighter during the night. Okay, and then sort of scaling up, we have some papers coming out of the group at Cornell led by Adrian Doctor, sort of at a continental scale, right? Sort of really pushing the limits of the information we can garner from these weather surveillance radars, and a very sort of novel approach of trying to get some demographic information by monitoring these movements. So you see here these two sort of transects across the northern US and the southern US, and Adrian and the group monitored traffic over those transects, and not only could quantify how many billions of birds are crossing over, but by comparing these interseasonal and latitudinal differences in traffic rates, get an idea of how much sort of survival of birds between these seasons. Again, looking at biomass and at a very broad scale across multiple species. And Pete had mentioned the science paper that just came out recently, the sort of the 3 billion birds lost paper, sort of the headline of that. But in addition to looking at, decades of coordinated bird monitoring surveys on the ground, Adrian included in this paper an analysis of changes in traffic rates from weather surveillance radars, and found similar declines at a broad scale in biomass of migratory birds over a 10-year window, about I think 1.3% per year. What you can see here, what is sort of alarming for the Midwest, is that those radars in the Midwest show some of the steepest declines during that time period. So highlighting sort of in a regional sense that the Midwest seems to be an area where we're seeing the steepest declines in migratory birds at a broad scale. And hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about that from Adrian on Thursday. So these are the speakers that are going to be talking more so about ongoing and recently completed projects. Amber had mentioned Jessica Tinklenberg, who is now Jessica Alcott. She also got married while she was finishing up her PhDs from Purdue. She's going to be talking about different aspects of her dissertation research, looking at changes in bird density during stopover over time, and also some habitat associations, looking at some urban ecology and stopover of birds in urban areas, as seen by weather surveillance radar and eBird data. And then Emily Cohen at University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, she's going to be sharing some work that we've recently sort of are wrapping up, mapping bird stopover around the Great Lakes and integrating that with some of the portable radar data from the Fish and Wildlife Service group out of Minnesota. And I'm also going to be talking about some of those data, but sort of focusing in on the impacts of artificial light at night in shaping where birds stop over, and sort of looking at a broader context and comparing what's going on in the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and what we can learn from that. Jay McEntee is at Missouri State University, and he's going to be sharing he's our acoustic contribution here, looking at geographic variation in song repertoires of Bewick's wrens, including sort of resident and migratory populations of Bewick's wrens. And then Frida Guo, who's a PhD student at Princeton University, who is interested in mapping stopover distributions of birds across the eastern US, if not the entire continent. So a very ambitious project trying to integrate NextRad data and eBird data to identify some of these important stopover areas for migrating land birds. And Adrian Doctor, who is at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, he's going to, actually I'm not quite sure what all he's going to talk about, but he did mention he was going to share some radar visualizations of bird migration through the Midwest, but may touch on some of the other work that he's been doing recently. So that's all I have. I'll hand it back to Tom.
Jeff. That's an awesome lineup and looks like a very exciting Thursday morning. So hopefully folks can attend all those sessions. And I want to remind everybody, if you want to learn more and have questions, go to these sessions or type stuff into the chat, and we'll try to get back to you. If you can attend any of the sessions over the next 2 days, then be aware that they will be recorded, and we'll have the contact information for the recordings and for our speakers available, as some of that information is already in the conference program. And so I want to remind you all we're coming back together at 12:30 or 1:30, depending on your Eastern or Central time zone. But now it's time for you all to talk. This is voluntary, of course, but we're going to set up some random Zoom breakout rooms, and we'd like you to do a couple things in these breakout rooms. Introduce yourself and they'll be fairly small rooms, eight people, I think, per room. And what's your favorite migratory bird in the Midwest? And maybe even more important than what it is, why is that your favorite migratory bird? A little bit of getting to know one another through stories. And then what do you think is the biggest issue facing migratory birds in our region? And we'll hopefully come back to some of those insights on the very last afternoon, which would be Thursday afternoon. So with that, I want to thank all our speakers from today. This has been really a great program. And I want to thank especially Stephanie Bilke, who has done a great job managing the logistics of the Zoom meeting and also the chat. Fantastic. And we look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow and this afternoon and Thursday morning, and then especially Thursday afternoon for our final session. So with that, Stephanie, let's put folks in breakout rooms. It looks like we have about 90 people left.